Hi, this is Jeffrey Wernick, and welcome to another segment of What the Wernick. I have a few points I would like to discuss today. Always I feel a little uncomfortable speaking in front of the camera when I'm not having a conversation with uh, other panelists, as opposed to just me just looking at a screen where I'm seeing myself. Um, so I would like to first topic I would like to talk about today. Topic has been in the news that maybe some are following, is with respect to the monetary policy and interest rates set by Powell and the Fed. Uh, we, it's been reported that Trump is basically trying to, as Trump tends to do, as he governs by extortion, where if Powell does not cut interest rates, then he'll look to put Powell in jail, and it seems like he will not pursue a prosecution of Powell if Powell does not. If he does cut interest rates. So, I don't think one thing should have anything to do with the other. whether you go to jail for committing a crime should not be a function of if you do what Trump says that you become immune from. Then you're exempt from committing the crime. That you can get away with the crime as long as you just behave the way Trump wants you to behave. And if you behave differently than the way Trump wants you to behave, then therefore so the only people subject to the law are really those that make Trump unhappy, and those that make Trump unhappy, he'll reward by basically making them exempt from their crimes. But I want to get to the concept of how the Fed sets its interest rates. And when Trump says that maybe interest rates should be cut, 1 or 2%, probably talking about the Fed funds rate. That's the rate that the Fed sets as a target. The Fed's target right now in the Fed funds rate is somewhere around 4.25%, and then if you sit back and say the Fed should maybe cut interest rates to 2 to 3%, the funds rate, you have to ask the question is, how did the Fed even come up with the number it had today of setting interest rates at Fed funds rate at the level they've currently set it at? And then where did Trump come up with his own number? And what's the justification of the number Trump throws out? Of course, usually Trump doesn't come up with any justification for any number other than it's his own intuition, his own instincts, and that his own intuition and instinct should never be questioned. So basically, we should set monetary policy according to Trump's instincts and intuitions. The Fed has, I think, the most objective measure, an imperfect measure, but I think an objective test of determining how reasonable Fed policy is a statistic that was created by John Taylor, I think out of Stanford, and it's called the Taylor Rule. And the Taylor Rule established an optimum monetary policy linked to how high inflation is relative to the target inflation rate, and how much of the output gap there is. And by output gap is how much is the output expected to grow versus what we think the potential of the economy is to grow. So in other words, the higher the inflation rate is relative to the target rate, the higher the Fed funds rate should be. And contrary to that, the larger the output gap. In other words, if the expected GDP growth is significantly less than potential GDP growth, that reduces the Fed funds rate. So right now we have inflation running around 2.7%. The target rate supposedly is around 2%. So right now that would cause for an increase in the Fed funds rate, to offset the fact that inflation is running higher than the Fed target, but also GDP growth is growing below the what's perceived as the ability of the economy to grow, and that would lower, the Fed funds rate. So, and it depends upon how you calculate the output gap and the inflation target. Really, the obligation of the Fed, as I read it, when it was that the Fed has to preserve the purchasing power of money, and the only way to preserve the purchasing power of money is to have a 0% inflation target, which used to be a long time ago. The United States used to be able to preserve an environment of no inflation. I think it's a myth that you need to have a 2% inflation in order to maximize economic growth, and that the optimal inflation rate is 2%. I don't think there's any empirical evidence that supports that claim, but it seems to be what has been accepted wisdom now for most of this century. It's been accepted wisdom that 2% should be the inflation target. So if you calculate right now, so as I said, the Fed funds rate is trading right about 4.25%, between 4.25% and 4.5%. And if you calculate the Taylor rule, depending upon how you measure what the output gap is, but a reasonable estimate for applying the Taylor rule is a Fed funds rate of 5.3%. So if you follow a Taylor rule, given the fact that we're not significantly off from what the potential of the economy is to grow, and we're not necessarily too far off, but we are above the inflation target, we need to see inflation come down further, and we also need to support economic growth according to the Taylor rule. So that inflation, that target would come out to about, that calculating the Taylor rule would come out to a Fed funds rate of about 5.3%. So basically, according to the Taylor rule, the Fed funds rate is already 1% below where the Taylor rule said it'd be. Now, you could come up with games with respect to what do you think should be the output gap, and if you think the output gap, is larger, then probably the range at which a Taylor rule could be calculated, depending upon your assumption of the output gap, could be somewhere around about 4.15% to about 5.5%. So you could say that basically following a Taylor rule, the Fed funds rate seems to be approximately correct, or lower by 50 to 100 basis points. So that's following this one rule again, but that's a rule where there's logic and an explanation behind it. People might want to challenge the logic and explanation, but the intuition seems to be pretty logical in the sense of, if inflation is higher than your target, you want to have inflation come down. But also, if you're growing less than you want to grow, you want to promote economic growth, and you have to balance off the trade-off between, having inflation increase and having economic growth, also supporting economic growth. So that's the logic behind, these assumptions. And typically when we've had Fed funds rates significantly below what the Taylor rule says, we've seen acceleration in the rate of inflation. So likely if we followed the Trump rule, we'd probably see inflation accelerate. I want to talk a little bit more about monetary policy and inflation, and I want to go back to the period of time of the aggregate that's most used for calculating the monetary aggregate that's supposedly the most stable with respect to GDP is M2. M2 is pretty much used as the monetary aggregate of choice by central banks all over the world. I can tell you that right now M2 growth has been about 4.5% this year. Last year, I think M2 growth was close to zero. So by the level of the increase in money supply, you could say the Fed is easier this year than it was last year. As a matter of fact, M2 growth has marginally accelerated the last couple of months, the last month or two. So there seems to be signs that the Fed has already allowed some degree of easing of monetary policy, even though the inflation is continuing to run above the target. I think the other day that Trump declared victory against inflation when the numbers came out to be 2.7%, when the expected number was 2.8%. But also, if you break out core inflation as opposed to non-core inflation, core inflation is a little over 3%. So core inflation is a little over 3%. We're running at core inflation rate. In other words, there are other factors that are very volatile in nature, and because they're volatile in month to month, we kind of smooth them out and consider them non-core inflation, like gas prices. So, so that way we could say maybe we're 100 basis points, depending upon is which measure of the CPI, I mean, Consumer Price Index, or personal consumption expenditures deflator that the Fed likes to use as well. The question is that number 2.7 or 3.1%? So the number could be about potentially 1% over our target rate, and that's pretty material to be 1% over the target rate from 2 to 3%. That's not a trivial percentage. That's a non-trivial percentage of that. But in spite of the fact that inflation continues to run above the target rate and above where it was in the fourth quarter of last year, inflation has accelerated for the fourth quarter of last year. And I'd like to also remind those that are watching is when Trump talked about inflation being much too high and that he would lower prices, he said that a year ago. He said that in August of 2024. So a year ago, he said prices were very, very high and he would bring them down substantially. So right now we're a year later and prices are higher than at the point that he said prices were very, very high, and where inflation was running about the same percentage it's running right now. So a year from now, prices on most things were lower than they were lower than they are today, and inflation's running about the same rate. And at that point in time, Trump said we had a serious inflation problem, and now inflation's running about the same rate. Prices are higher than they were where he said they already were too high, and Trump has said we've beat inflation. So of course that's a hypocrisy. But that's what we get not only from Trump, but we get from all politicians, is we get hypocrisy and bullshit. So I did want to point out when people like to talk about what inflation was at its highest point, and yes, we had some spiking like of egg prices and a few other things late 2024 and early 2025. But when Trump came out speaking about how bad inflation was, he made those comments in August of 2024. And that was the date he said that when he was president, prices would come down dramatically. They have not come down dramatically. They've not come down at all from the point in time he promised that prices would come down dramatically. Okay, they haven't. They're higher. Okay, and again, he described that inflation rate as an unacceptably high inflation rate, and now inflation is defeated. Okay, at that point in time, he did not think the Fed should lower interest rates. But now he does think the Fed should reduce interest rates. So a year ago, Trump said prices were too high, inflation was running too high, even though it's about the same rate, and the economy was on the verge of collapse, yet the Fed should not cut interest rates. And here we are a year later, prices are higher, inflation rate's about the same rate, and there is, I think I'm frozen here. And that the inflation rate, okay, yeah, I think I'm unfrozen right now, and so we certainly, there are no conditions on why there should be a material change in the policy of monetary policy from a year ago to today. We're certainly in no better conditions. And according to Trump, the forecast for the economy is even better. So the output gap is should be smaller right now because how much great the inflation is. So that justifies a higher funds rate. So Trump's words justify a higher funds rate. I also want to give him context of the fact of monetary growth. Okay, monetary growth is running about right now about 4.5% year-on-year growth, and for M2. I want to give you context that in 2020 and 2021, the Fed was governed by a majority of people who were nominated and appointed and voted in by Trump. So it was a Trump majority Fed, and that Trump majority Fed increased the money supply and about 40% over an 18-month period of time between 2021. Not only that, they increased the money supply about 40% during that period of time. The fiscal deficit right now, our fiscal deficit is about $37 trillion, marginally above $37 trillion. The fiscal deficit of 2020, Trump's last year, and Biden's first year, 2021, our fiscal deficit was $6 trillion just those 2 years. So $6 trillion of our $37 trillion deficit occurred just in 2 years. So what did we have in 2020 and 2021? And I would also like to point out that Trump had actually proposed a larger fiscal deficit for 2021 if he was elected president. So if he was elected president, the 2021 would have had a higher fiscal deficit. Would have been we probably would have had then, instead of about the $6 trillion deficit accumulated over 2020 and 2021, probably would have been about $6.5 trillion. It probably would have been about $500 billion more Trump's proposal than what was actually implemented. About $250 billion to about $500 billion more was Trump's proposal. But Trump also was proposing at the time negative interest rates. So who knows what kind of inflation rate if the Fed followed Trump's instincts and intuition, and that we had a even large growth in the money supply, and we probably would have had and a larger growth in the fiscal deficit. That's what Trump's instincts and intuition would have driven, and at least Biden, to some extent, giving some credit, is that when the Fed realized that they had printed too much money, they then decided they took aggressive policy to reverse the mistake that they made, and they acknowledged that they made a mistake, and that's when we had inflation, peak at around about 9%. It didn't stay there, I think, very long, and then came down pretty rapidly. And it came down pretty rapidly because the Fed contracted the money supply, and the contraction of the money supply by raising interest rates. But the question is, were those raising of the interest rates a function of mistake of Biden or a function of mistake of Trump? I'd say more of the blame goes to Trump, but blame also goes to Biden because he did spend a lot of money in 2021, less than Trump would have spent, but it still was too much, too intervention in the economy, and. But as far as the monetary expansion that occurred by the people that Trump appointed of an independent central bank, clearly Biden doesn't have any blame associated with the action of a whole bunch of people who are basically independent, who Trump trusted to exercise the best judgment over monetary policy. So. I think people called it a Bidenflation. Biden was a victim of circumstances. If Trump had been elected, we probably would have seen the same level of inflation or even higher if we implemented the Trump plan of even greater deficit spending and negative interest rates. So I think that I seem to have somebody ask a question. So let me stop for a second. And I got a question. Because I like answering questions, so I encourage people to ask questions that they have. I got a question: why do I think this was just the same under Biden? Meet the same boss as the old boss. then somebody else said the inflation numbers are rigged. Well, I think we should take most government statistics with a grain of salt. I don't think that that there's flaws in the way they calculate these numbers. But I operate under a general rule of thumb that whatever the government tells us, that's the best. I think, like any company, you have certain rules under which you report information, and then you, to the extent that the rules have some flexibility to them, you make the rules, you make the numbers look as good as they can for you, because you want to show that your government is successful. So I basically think economic statistics, on the most part, are designed to present the best case scenario, because that's the incentive of any government, is to make themselves look as successful as possible. There is alternative statistics. A site that I use is a site called Shadow Stats, and according to Shadow Stats, inflation is running about 4 to 5% higher, and if you take a look at the Shadow Stats numbers, because of the higher rate of inflation, as reported by them, we never really recovered from the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, that basically we've had negative GDP growth just about every year since then. And maybe that explains why so many Americans are so dissatisfied, is because they don't feel their circumstances as being materially better, and that's why they want more. That's why they're so disaffected by quote the establishment, and want anti-establishment politicians. I think that was greatly reflected in the 2016 election, where really the one who got the most popular vote in the Democratic primaries, I think, was Sanders. The special delegates is what gave Hillary the nomination, but it seems like amongst the rank and file of the Democratic Party, Sanders was the candidate of choice. So it seems to me the preference was for an anti-establishment candidate, whether it was Trump on behalf of the Republicans and Sanders on behalf of the Democrats, that they were rejecting. They were rejecting the status quo and wanted to move significantly away from the status quo. And it seems to me that that's been the position the American people have had for the last 15 years or so, is they don't want to be represented by the status quo, that they want significant change from the status quo, because they think the status quo has delivered them this bad sense of not a very great future ahead. So I tried to look at it. When I give you analysis, I'm looking at it someone as I'm an investor. I make my money. I've made my money my entire life as a speculator. So as a speculator, there's an intuition that I followed. It was I think it was expressed well, and I'm not giving it adequate credit for how elegantly it was said, but one of my mentors, Fisher Black, in the year he gave the presidential address to the American Finance Association, he wrote a paper called Noise, and in that paper he called Noise, he said, what's the difference between economics and finance? In economics, you have basically independent variables, dependent variables, and an error term, and that error term is considered just pure noise. So there's no information value embedded in that error term. He said in finance, it's very different. There's independent variable, dependent variable, and there is an error term, but the error term is not just noise. The error term is noise, but deeply embedded in the noise is the most valuable information. And someone who knows how to make money in the capital markets is the one that's is finding like the proverbial needle in a haystack. They're the ones that can sift through all the noise and find valuable information, and that they can trade on that valuable information. But the search costs for this valuable information are very high and requires a lot of skills associated with being able to filter through all the noise and be good at what some people might call signal extraction. So there's a whole bunch of noise out there, and embedded in all this noise, there's a signal embedded in this noise. And if you're good at detecting that signal that's embedded in all this noise, you'll make money, okay? This is how I've made money my whole life. So I can't afford, since I've made my whole life as a speculator, starting with $5,000. I made money my entire life basically as a speculator. After I made money as a speculator, I did go in and do some entrepreneurial things. But initially, what gave me the freedom to do that was the money I made through speculating, and it's still my primary source of my whatever wealth I've accumulated. And so this is the game that I have played. I cannot afford to look at things from a Democratic perspective, from a MAGA perspective, from a progressive perspective, from any sort of partisan perspective. If I bring partisan perspective into my analysis, I'll lose money. Okay. I'm not into losing money. Okay. I'm into making my money productive. So whatever insights I have, that doesn't mean my insights are always right, because they aren't. It means my insights are never driven by any sense of partisan analysis of numbers. Okay, I got to look at the numbers dispassionately. I got to look at them coldly. I got to, as I was a big fan of CSI when it was the first version of it, Las Vegas, with Grissom, and Grissom always said you gotta go where the evidence takes you. So that's my approach to investing, is I got to go where the evidence takes me. I can't come up with descriptions that make me feel a narrative that makes me feel happy because it coincides with my ideological beliefs. If I do that, I would go broke. So I have to just be cold and dispassionate, look at the evidence, focus on what the evidence tells me, and ignore the personalities and completely ignore the personalities. So I'm trying to give you some insight into how I think about setting of monetary policy. And I'd also like to say I think the Fed should be abolished. So I'm not coming from this as a defense of the Fed. Because I will never defend the Fed. I think fiat money is corrupt. I call bankers banksters. I think the whole financial system is corrupt, and the financial system is corrupt because it's predicated upon a corrupt form of money, which is fiat paper money, which our founding fathers thought was corrupt money. And when Madison encouraged Washington to convene the Constitutional Convention, one of the things that Madison fought was the issuance of paper money in many of the states. And it was the proliferation of paper money that was of great concern to Madison, and it's why the Constitution had defined dollars as a fixed conversion rate of into either gold or silver, so that basically all money in circulation was just a note, and that note was collateralized by gold or silver. So there was not a fiat note; it was a note that actually was collateralized by either gold or silver. So they understood as that fiat money was a corrupting influence. Matter of fact, Benjamin Franklin said there might never have been a revolution if the British did not corrupt money in the colonies. And the founders, several founders, had said the day we corrupt money, the day we link the issuance of money to the state, is the day that that tyranny will become inevitable. So, and why will it become inevitable? Because the government will then be able to fund itself beyond the scope of what they thought the government should grow, and fiat money could help facilitate the growth of government. And they proved to be right, because up until the creation of the Fed in 1913, government spending in the federal level was like 3.5% of GDP, as opposed to about 25% of GDP now. And we've seen a great growth in the regulatory state as well. So essentially, the fiat money became correlated with both a much bigger government and significantly more heavy-handed government regulation. I hope that this will give people some insights in how to think about, monetary policy. I think that people should always say, when somebody throws a number out and says, "I think this rate should be X percent. Okay, they should give a rationale behind it. If they can't give a rationale behind it, it's just bullshit. Okay, or that person could just claim, some insight into the way that they know what the optimal rate is. If Trump knows the optimal rate at all time and his instincts are so perfect, I don't know how somebody whose instincts are so perfect had so many businesses, go out of business. His instincts said that, I remember speaking to one of the lenders at, I think it was Bankers Trust, that lent him money against when he bought the shuttle. And he basically said, I don't remember if he bought the Eastern shuttle. At that point in time, there were two basically shuttles. There were Eastern and Pan Am. One had about 55% of the marketplace. The other had about 45% of the marketplace. Trump went into Bankers Trust, as somebody in Bankers Trust told me, and said that his business plan was to paint over the airplanes so they look nice, do a little refurbishing, and rename them from whatever shuttle it was to the Trump shuttle, and that the shuttle he was buying had 45% of the market, and just doing those changes because of his branding would make the change 55% of the market. And that was his instinct. That was his intuition. And it didn't happen. And the airline went bust, pretty quickly. When he built his casinos in Atlantic City and boasted about that, and his instincts and his intuition said this would be the greatest experiences, in the world, and they would be great investments, and they went bankrupt. So that was his instincts and his intuitions. I also one that I am very personally aware of. I actually with his casinos, I betted on their bankruptcy, so that I made money on. And I had also another experience with another project that was supported by Trump. I was looking at an architect had brought me to a site in Baja California, Mexico, basically pitching me on the idea that Trump was promoting a real estate project in Baja California, and the initial promotion had great success. So I actually sent one of the people that worked for me to, I think it was San Diego, to listen to Ivanka pitch the project. And there seemed to be many really interested buyers. And there was an instinct, an intuition regarding why this project would be a success. And so I went to visit the Trump's project myself. I went to the site. I spoke to people in the showroom. I saw the model, and and then I sent my another person who worked for me a second time to see Ivanka again, pitch it to see whether there was as much enthusiasm the second time around as the first time around. And I did see a lot of enthusiasm. So I bought a lot about a couple of kilometers south of Trump's, a better lot. What made it a better lot is that it had a better shape, so it would have more frontage to the Pacific Ocean. So the shape of the Trump lot was not very optimal, and the lot that I got was much nicer, and I had done extensive due diligence and had discovered there was not very good title to a lot of the land in Baja California, so there could not be a lot of competition out there, because if other people went in looking to buy lots, they'd find not many lots they had really good title to, and if you can, and they would not take the risk of spending that type of money. And basically all I did was I leveraged off of Trump promoting his project. So I didn't sell my project, I didn't develop it. Instead, what I did with my project was I got the seller of the lot. I gave the seller, I added $500,000 to the purchase price for the seller to give me all the permits. So I had an architect develop the architecture for the lot, so I could get in and get given with the architectural project. I could get all the permits for electricity and water and all the entitlements that were necessary to develop the project. So the day I closed on the project, I could have in practice really begun developing the very next day. And when I had all that in place, since the fact there was so much enthusiasm for Trump marketing this project, that basically all I did is I flipped it to somebody who believed a lot of the hype, and so I basically bought the land, and within a few months, I flipped it for about twice the price, because there was a lot of people interested in developing because of the Trump hype. And what happened to the Trump project? It went bankrupt. So, and I think the land I sold, I think, never got developed. I never really paid attention to what happened, but the Trump project went developed. So if the question is, if you've seen somebody who's gone into many institutions and said, here are my instincts, here's my intuition, and has been wrong so often, I wouldn't, that's not somebody I would trust to rely upon their instincts and intuitions. I mean, I certainly that would not be my criteria relying on person. I mean, Trump said when Biden was elected president, we'd have a depression and a stock market collapse. If anyone took his words seriously and would put money behind his words, you'd find that you would not be wealthier today, probably putting your money behind Trump's words. Trump doesn't put his own money behind his own words. So I'm not making this point just to dump on Trump. My point is that we should never have monetary policy driven by the instincts and intuition of any one single individual. Okay, so we have to have some sort of rules and procedures. And if those rules and procedures seem to be ineffective over time, we got to learn, and then we modify those rules and procedures. For me, I just dumped the Fed, and I would have currency competition, and I would abolish legal tender laws as well as abolishing the Fed, and let the marketplace determine what the best form of money is. I trust markets more than I trust anything else, and so I like to defer as much to markets as possible. Somebody's asking me would I invest in the S&P 500 right now. I'm not a registered investment advisor, so I can't give investment advice, but I can say what I'm doing with my own money. Almost all my wealth is in Bitcoin. I hold gold as well, but a significant portion of it is a super majority is in Bitcoin, and whatever free cash flow I have, I put into Bitcoin. So I think that Bitcoin is still one for Bitcoin for me is a philosophical bet. It's not just a speculative asset. So for me, the attributes of Bitcoin of being, immutable, of being permissionless, of the ledger itself never lying. It has a fixed monetary policy, so you're never surprised by Bitcoin. Nobody can have any influence over the rules of mining Bitcoin. Given all those great attributes about Bitcoin, I don't think there's any greater expression of freedom than there is through the attributes embedded in Bitcoin. It's the world I want to live in. I want to live in a world that's permissionless. I want to live in a world where I can engage in transactions where the identity of the other party is not necessarily what's important. What's important is the nature of the transaction I'm engaging in with another party. And whatever transaction it is, I want it to be irreversible. I want to trust that once we've shaken hands and had a deal, there's no walking back on that deal. So, and transactions in Bitcoin are not reversible. So then they're censorship resistant. There's no one can censor a transaction. When any transaction done between two peers, and that's the type of relationships I like. I reject all forms of hierarchy. So given the fact that I reject all forms of hierarchy, I don't accept any system where hierarchy is an attribute of that system. There is no hierarchy, in BitChute. So in Bitcoin. So my bet on Bitcoin is not only a bet on a speculative asset, it's bet on an underlying philosophy, and it's bet on, I think, the best underlying philosophy. So I think it'll prevail as a speculative asset because its underlying philosophy is the best underlying philosophy. And I think it's the underlying philosophy that will prevail. And given the fact that I think the underlying philosophy will prevail, I think Bitcoin will prevail. And so my expectation is sometime in the next decade, we'll probably see $1 million price on Bitcoin. So even with the appreciation, I spoke to my friends when Bitcoin was, under $1 and then under $5. And I encourage friends to accumulate Bitcoin. Back then, I have one person who interviewed me 6-7 years ago or something like that. She remembered meeting me at a dinner in 2010, and that when she started asking me what I wanted to invest in, I started speaking to her about Bitcoin. So and then I'm sure it was just a few dollars. And a bunch of my friends did buy, or some of them, and then they sold pretty quickly. And then when the price kept rising, they say, well, when it gets back to that price, then I'll buy again. And of course, they never found that price again, and they never bought again. So Bitcoin right now looks high relative to, what it was a year ago or 2 years ago. But I think Bitcoin is low relative to where I think it's going to go. So I don't look at how much it's performed. I view as a metric. And then you're asking me what my metric is. So you're just not following my instincts or intuitions. I think the market cap of gold today is about $22 trillion. I think the market cap of Bitcoin is about $3 trillion or so. I think the market cap of gold is almost 10 times the market cap of Bitcoin. So my bet is simple, that I think that right now, that what's considered the best form of money is the dollar, and then maybe the second best form of money is gold, and then maybe the third best form of money is Bitcoin. Maybe some people will say the euro. But given the fact that I think that Bitcoin has attributes that are better than gold, and I used to be a gold person, I think Bitcoin will have a market cap higher than the current market cap of gold. So I think Bitcoin will replace gold as the second most valuable alternative form of money. So I think the Bitcoin market cap could grow to about above where gold's market cap is today, which is $22 trillion about. So I think that Bitcoin has a 10x from the current level, and I think that as Bitcoin continues as more people now, given the fact that institutions are involved in the game, which is not something I care about, but it has seemed to encourage more people to participate in the space, given the fact that they've had a party they trust validate, Bitcoin. So you might see more treasuries hold Bitcoin. You might see more central banks accumulate Bitcoin, and you might see also it continue to have adoption amongst the people, because still only a small percentage of the global population, owns any Bitcoin. So given the fact that I think that that adoption will continue to grow in spurts, that I think that there's a lot of upside, and I think there's so much more upside in Bitcoin than anything else, that I feel comfortable keeping a significant a super majority of my wealth in Bitcoin. But I want to say I don't endorse other people doing that. I'm a plunger. I don't have a diversified money. I consider myself a professional at this. I've been doing it for over 50 years. So I think in my own mind, I've established a good enough track record, that I can trust my instincts and intuitions, because I don't have examples of going into bankruptcy so far. One never knows what the future holds. So my past performance is not a predictor of future performance, but I'm comfortable with it. But I wouldn't encourage anybody else to do what I do with respect to, I've never run a diversified portfolio. So I've never held many positions. I've never tried to diversify my money because I'm not interested in getting returns of 8, 10, 20. I want to make 30, 40, 50, 100% a year. I'm not interested in making, small percentage a year. And I'm willing to take more risk than most people will take in order to get significantly higher returns. And I feel comfortable taking bets that nobody else will take at the time I took the bet. I mean, now a lot of people will bet on Bitcoin, but when I first did it, people thought I was crazy. But almost every bet I've taken, people thought I was crazy at the time I took the bet because it seemed very risky at the time. I mean, that's basically how I've made my money, and it's worked so well so far. And hopefully, I'll be smart enough to recognize that if it stops working, I'll figure out what's next. So, so in that context, you really have to be really focus on getting rid of any sense of cognitive bias and looking at things as they are, not how you'd like to see them. And the better you are at seeing things as they are, rather than the way you'd like to see them, you should not necessarily have this partisan model in your mind. It's good to have a model in your mind of how you think the world works, but if your observation is proven by your own trading experience, then you gotta modify your model if it's not working very well. So everybody needs to have an underlying philosophy, but nobody should be certain that their underlying philosophy is correct. People should always have the attitude, well, this is the best explanation I have today. It doesn't mean it's the right explanation. It means that today I don't have a better explanation, but I want to get smarter every single day. And that's my objective as a trader, is to try and figure out how I can get smarter every single day, rather than be satisfied that I know everything that needs to be known. I've accumulated, I think, a certain amount of wisdom because I've had an open mind for a long period of time, but I also have enough wisdom to understand that there's a lot more for me to learn, and I got to keep my mind open. I got to keep my eyes open. I got to keep all my 5 senses open, so I can continue to make sure that I don't get so romantically involved in my Bitcoin position that maybe something does happen that I didn't anticipate. That if it does, I'll see it sooner than somebody else or most other people. And if I see it sooner than other people, I can get out and invest in something else. So if something better comes along, so far my track record is I've been pretty good at whatever I've bet on. When something better comes along, I've been pretty good at spotting that, and I will continue to keep my eyes open. But at this point in time, I've not found anything that comes remotely close to being as appealing to me as Bitcoin. Recently, Ethereum, I think, I've read is outperforming Bitcoin, and I do hold a small amount of Ethereum, but nothing substantial. And Ethereum functions very differently than Bitcoin. So people should not lump them together. The utility of Bitcoin is completely different than the utility of Ethereum, and that's not a topic I'll get into today. The other topic I want to get into today, I have 2 more topics I'd like to discuss. One other topic I'd like to discuss today of the 2 is this issue of the federal takeover of DC. Here again, what is DC a safe city or not a safe city? Should we believe the statistics or are they not to believe? So I'm not going to put great faith that the statistics are perfectly accurate. According to the statistics, Washington D.C. has been safer than it's been in a very long time. And this is all political theater and distraction because people close to Trump got beaten up. And so Trump's reacting to not the general crime rate of DC, of maybe people he doesn't give a shit about, but of somebody he does give a shit about, the person I guess they refer to as Big Balls. And it's a tragedy what happened to him. is that touched him personally. So he's responding as a personal response, not really, because he believes in the policy. It's a personal response that something happened to somebody that was loyal to his efforts, and that was the response to that. But I don't like these ad hoc things. When we talk about, like violence in cities, okay, it's always easy to talk about, oh, New York is so violent and LA is so violent, this is violent. But as an individual, every time you go out in the street, it's not the absolute amount of crimes that are committed. It's the rate of crimes as a percentage of the population that determines how much risk you have. So, I mean, if you're in a population of 5 people and 5 people have been murdered, okay, that's 100% murder rate. Okay, you don't want to live in a city that everyone. It's a small population, but once you move in, you're going to get murdered. And then you live in a city that has 12 million people, okay, and there are 100 murders, okay. The probability that any one person being murdered, the murder rate is very low. So, so for your own personal safety, the number that's more important is not the absolute number, but the percentage number, the rates. That's what's important. So I looked at certain statistics. I used Grok, and so I looked at what's the top cities with the highest murder rates in 2025. Okay, so of which none of these cities is Trump doing anything to make the citizens safer. Okay, number 1, St. Louis, Missouri. Okay, murder rate of 69 per 100,000 residents. Baltimore, 51 per 100,000 residents. That's 2. New Orleans, 40 per 100,000 residents. Detroit, number 4, 40 per 100,000 residents. Cleveland, Ohio, number 5, 34 per 100,000 residents. Las Vegas, Nevada, 31 per 100,000 residents. Kansas City, Missouri, also 31 per 100,000 residents is number 7. Memphis, Tennessee, is about 28 per 100,000 residents. New Jersey, about 25 per 100,000 residents. And number 10 is Chicago, 24 per 100,000 residents. Those are the murder rates. So Washington, D.C. is not there. New York is not there. Los Angeles is not there. So all the cities that Trump talks about as being areas where there's significant crime, yeah, there's a lot more crime because there are a lot more people. But the incidence of crime, which determines the likelihood that you'll be a victim of crime, you're more likely to be a victim of crime in these cities than the cities that Trump has named. The cities Trump has named, you're less likely to be a victim of crime than these cities. Okay, then there were some smaller cities that have even higher rates. East St. Louis, Illinois, and Anniston, Alabama have exceptionally high murder rates. East St. Louis actually tops the list, but these have smaller populations. So I then took at the numbers of violent crime, not just murders. And for violent crime, Memphis is number 1, St. Louis is number 2, Detroit is number 3, Maryland is number 4, Birmingham is number 5, Alabama, that's Kansas City, Missouri, 6, Cleveland, Ohio, 7, Little Rock, Arkansas, 8, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 9, Stockton, California, 10. So these are one, again, not just murders. These are now for violent crimes. And for violent crimes, Anniston, Alabama has the highest per capita violent crime, but it has a small population. But I guess for the people who do live there are highly exposed to both murder and violent crimes. Doesn't sound like a very appealing place to live. Now I looked at rape statistics. Now for rapes, St. Joseph, Missouri is number 1, New Orleans, Louisiana, 2, Canton, Ohio, 3, Flint, Michigan, 4, Salt Lake City, 5, Anchorage, Alaska, 6, Cleveland, Ohio, 7, Detroit, Michigan, 8, Memphis, Tennessee, 9, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 10. Okay, so I don't see any talk about federalizing any of those cities where apparently the incidence of rape, violence, and murder are significantly higher than they are in Washington, D.C. Then I found the last thing I asked Grok were the large U.S. cities with the lowest murder rates. So these are large cities now with the population being at least greater than 250,000 people, which have the lowest murder rates of any city with a population greater than 250,000 people. Well, the lowest murder rate is Honolulu, then San Diego, then Austin, Texas, then San Jose, California, Raleigh, North Carolina, Virginia Beach, Virginia, Mesa, Arizona, New York City, New York. New York City, seventh lowest with a large murder rate in the country. San Francisco, 9. Portland, Oregon, 10. And then if you just look at that from my last statistic will be related to violent crime. Honolulu is again the least. Irvine, California, 2nd. San Diego, California, 3rd. Raleigh, pretty much the same cities, 4th. San Jose, California, 5th. Virginia Beach, Virginia, 6th. Mesa, Arizona, 7th. Austin, Texas, 8th. New York, 9. Boston, 10. So you can see with a lot of the stuff being said about New York for a large city above 250,000 people is one of the 10 safest cities in the country. So, and again, of the most dangerous cities, you don't see the cities that Trump has named. So again, if somebody's going to do something, okay, they should have a criteria for doing it, and they should apply that criteria consistently. Okay, if not, it's just ad hoc. Okay, there is no rhyme or reason to what they're doing it. You know, all proper actions should have a principle behind that proper action. So, you know, if Trump says, you know, one thing is Trump going to Congress and saying, you know, I'd like to take over, you know, every city where the citizens are at risk, that this is an unacceptable level of risk for any citizen to face. And if any local government does not comply with at least keeping citizens this safe, that should trigger the right of a federal government. That's a political conversation, whether it's constitutional or not. You know, that's a separate conversation. But at least that's a philosophical conversation I could respect. There's a criteria being established, and that criteria is being established neutrally across the board. It's not like, oh, I like this governor, I like this senator, I don't like this person, they pissed me off, so I want to look for an excuse of taking them over. There's an established procedure, okay? There's established rules, pre-established criteria, okay? And the goal should be so that every American should be subject to, if their own local government can't protect them according to a certain criteria, that could trigger federal action. Again, I don't want to discuss right now the constitutionality of that, because I think constitutionally it's questionable, but at least I'm talking about how you approach doing something. Nothing should be. It's very easy to say, oh, this person got beat up, and this person, which are all, of course, tragedies and certainly terrible things, you know. But terrible things happen. The question is, once we intervene, we have to have a philosophy about how we do it, why we're doing it, and we have to apply it equally. And Trump should be concerned about not just people in the nation's capital. His obligation, he doesn't represent the people in the nation's capital. He's not the mayor, okay? He represents the people of the United States. So his obligation of keeping people safe is as great everywhere else in the country, you know, not just the nation's capital, because he's there, okay? And people he likes are there, and his staff is there, and he wants to make sure that people are important to him are safer than people anywhere else, okay? So that's just not right. It isn't right. We should demand more, okay? And we should demand explanations, not just hearing something, you know, oh, I love Trump or I hate Trump. Nothing I'm talking about right now has anything really to do with Trump. I'm talking about really a criteria. If the federal government decides that local governments are doing an inadequate job of keeping their people safe, they should set metrics. And any local, municipal, state government that doesn't comply with those metrics, doesn't meet those metrics, you know, and they'll have the incentive to hit those metrics, because I guess they want to avoid, you know, federal takeover. And again, I'm now not talking about the constitutionality of it, because I don't think it is constitutional, but at least it's a procedure I can understand. It's a procedure where, again, there's a national policy, And the president is supposed to set national policy. They're a national politician. They're not a local politician. They're a national politician. So I can understand his concern about DC because he's there. His friends are there. His family is there. People are working for him there. But he should want you and I to be as safe as any of them. Okay? Every American has the same right to feeling safe leaving their home. So there should not be one rule for one location. It should not be ad hoc in nature. It should be. This thing happened. It's a terrible thing happened. So I'm taking it over. So this is not how policy should be set, based upon executive fiat. I have another question. Again, I'm trying to stop to be responsive to everyone who asks things. At least this is more of a comment. Someone says income tax is illegal, but somehow what is legal is ignored by our corrupt legal system. Well, no one's going to get any disagreement from me. People who have challenged. Do I think the income tax system is legal? No, I think there's been some questions about whether the amendment that allowed the income tax, also the same year that we created the Fed. In 1913, we created the Fed. We created the amendment to have an income tax, and we also began we changed how we elect senators from being chosen by their state legislatures to popular vote in the states. So we basically got a more powerful federal government at the expense of states' rights. So there's been some people who have questioned the legality of how the amendment to implement an income tax was not perfected properly. But the people who I've read who have challenged that ended up in jail. So it might be true that it's illegal. It might be true that it's corrupt. I think it's illegal, and I definitely think it's corrupt. But the question is if will you get away with making that argument at court, or is that a path to jail? It's probably a path to jail, and this might be a path to jail because the courts themselves are corrupt, because the courts now seem to be more interested in protecting the state from the people as opposed to the people from the state. The courts are really, from my reading of the Constitution, their obligation was really to protect the people, not the state. So, as Jefferson had said, the government has to fear the people, not the people the government. And I think the courts have supported the efforts of people being in fear of the government rather than the government being in fear of the people. And so I think it's a contradiction to what the founders had designed. But I do think I do think that the income tax is probably illegal. But I think it's a losing argument. Whether it's illegal or not, you're not going to win that argument in a court of law. And I do think it's corrupt, and I think our legal system, is generally corrupt. I try and do as many business deals. I try and rely upon arbitration clauses, and private law adjudication, rather than public courts. I think there are certain courts that will function better than others, and there are certain jurisdictions that do a better job than others. But being someone who has, who I've bought litigation rights, so I've done litigation finance. So I'm very experienced in funding litigations. So therefore, I have to be able to read a lot of the judges' opinions in the jurisdictions where the litigation is filed, because because it's not as if the same facts will be perceived differently in different jurisdictions that are being adjudicated, and you have to be very knowledgeable in doing that type of specific research and a lot of due diligence. The same with bankruptcy law. You have to read the opinions of bankruptcy law judges because there's significant violations from what's called the absolute priority rule. The absolute priority rule that basically says, the most senior people in the capital structure get paid off fully before people junior get paid. But basically in bankruptcy rulings, there are deviations from the absolute priority rule, and the deviations vary from bankruptcy court to bankruptcy court. So you have to become familiar with that specific bankruptcy judge and reading that stuff, so that that you become that if you do bankruptcy investing, who the judge is and what jurisdiction is. Even if the law is pretty much the same, the application of law will be somewhat different. So you have to pay attention to all these other factors. So I would like to just talk about one thing today, because I only intended to be an hour, and we're now a little bit over an hour, and I don't want to do these What the Wernicks too long. But I want to say something that I think is probably going to piss off a lot of people. Not that I care. Just a caveat. In part of the policies that was having regarding the negotiations with, quote, tariffs with Canada and the U.S., and we talk about the how they're doing in fighting drugs coming into this country, and fentanyl deaths in this country, and also who's responsible for the production, sales, distribution and of drugs, and the laundering of money of drugs. And given the fact that we're now including drugs cartels as being terrorist organizations, I have some comments on that. I think that first, we expect, like in the case of Mexico, I want to give some context to that. Fentanyl is equally available all over the world. Okay, why is it such a prosperous market here? Why does Americans seem to demand and be addicted so much to fentanyl? I looked up in Grok. I asked what are the percentage of fentanyl deaths occur in the United States. Okay, I got a number that was between 83 and 88%. Is what Grok said. So let's say about 85% of all fentanyl deaths are in the U.S. Why aren't we asking ourselves a question? Okay, is Americans are nowhere near 85% of the global population. Okay, and do you think that? So is it easier to distribute fentanyl in the United States than it is anywhere else? Is it, or are Americans more addicted to fentanyl than anywhere else? And if they are more addicted to fentanyl than anywhere else, what's the reason for that addiction? Question is where does our responsibility lie? Okay, why is the supplier responsible? Okay, if people smoke cigarettes, is the cigarette manufacturer responsible? It's interesting, when somebody goes out and fires a gun, okay, and kills somebody with a gun, we don't hold the manufacturer responsible. We hold the person who shot the gun responsible. Okay, the murderer we hold responsible, not the manufacturer of the arm that killed somebody. Okay, but with drugs, we hold the supplier responsible. Drugs seem to be one of the few areas that we hold the supplier completely responsible, and we don't hold responsible. Most of these drugs they're sold in the United States. Okay, so where's the money laundered? The money is laundered in the United States. Okay, where's the distribution occurring? The distribution is occurring in the United States. We're also told that the border is shut. So if the border is shut, how is it getting in the United States? Because we keep hearing this bragging that the border is closed. So in theory, if the border is closed, no more fentanyl is getting in, but we still hear that it's still a crisis. So is it fentanyl that's produced here, or is it fentanyl produced there that's still getting across the border? So then maybe the border isn't shut. It's easily shut for people who are, and Trump has probably done a good job with deterring people to come to the United States illegally through this policy. It's a policy of terror in my position, but it's an effective policy of terror that has significantly discouraged people from looking to cross the border. But I don't know how successful it is keeping fentanyl across the border. But it seems to me, you focus on doing, in life, you focus on doing what you can do yourselves, not forcing other people to do things because you don't want to take responsibility for your problems. So in Mexico, most of when they recover guns, illegal guns, like the drugs cartels ship into the United States that kill people, illegal guns from U.S. get shipped into Mexico that kill people. Okay, most of the guns that are confiscated, during in violent crimes and cartel acts are guns that were procured from the United States. The cartels might also get them from other people who the United States sold them to in other markets, and they might get them in black markets. But we do know that there's a lot of gun sales, along the border, and there's a significant amount of gun sales, along the border. And yet, so we don't feel responsible for keeping illegal guns out of Mexico. Guns that are illegal in Mexico. They're legal here, but they're illegal there. We have no responsibility associated with that. But supposedly Mexico is supposed to be responsible for keeping drugs out of the U.S., but we have no responsibility for keeping guns out of Mexico. We have no responsibility for finding this distribution. The distribution is obviously here, okay? The money is here. The distribution is here, okay? We don't need to stop the production. We got to stop the distribution of it. We're expecting to have Mexico shut down production while we can't shut down distribution. Okay, we have a lot more money to shut down distribution than Mexico has in shutting down the cartels. Okay, and the cartels, where does their money come from? Their money comes from the U.S. They sell in the U.S. Their profits are from the U.S. So the U.S. and their gun purchases from the U.S. So it's the U.S. consumer that funds the cartels. It's the U.S. gun manufacturers that arm the cartels, okay? And we hold no responsibility for that. The people who consume drugs and have these addictions, nobody's coercing them. The cartels are not going around to schools and other places, putting a gun to people's head and telling them, you gotta take these drugs or I'll shoot you. So, it's terrible. And I don't want to make light of people who have these types of addictions, but we ought to instead of trying to blame the cartels for all this behavior. Many cartels just see themselves as business people. They're business people saying there's a lot of people who want this, and they're creative at trying to figure out how to satisfy demand of an illegal product, but where there's a great demand. So as we discovered through previous periods of time, like prohibition, a lot of people like to drink. We prohibited drink, and what did we get? We got drinking controlled by organized crime. That's what we got. So how did we end the organized crime? We ended prohibition, and then people didn't have to go underground to speakeasy, the other organizations, and people promote the illegal manufacture. But human beings are innovative and creative. If there's a marketplace out there and something's illegal, the fact that it's illegal is just a cost of doing business to them. If you look at the business perspective, if you look at this I look at this from an economist's perspective, there's a cost of doing business. So if you're doing an illicit business, then the cost of doing business is the probability that you'll get caught. So how much money will you make, and what's the probability that you'll be caught? Well, it seems to me in the U.S., for those who are involved in sales and distribution, the probability to be caught is not very high. So there's not enough discouraging. Right now, we're doing a very good job of discouraging, illegals from coming here by, rounding people up and, depriving them of their due process and shipping them out. And we've shipped out enough in such a horrible way that other people having second thoughts and third thoughts about coming here and saying, I don't want to come here. So one of the great successes of this policy, that's a policy I don't support, but it's a policy that I have to acknowledge has been successful in the sense that it's so horrendous in nature that it has acted as an effective deterrent. And I think it's been successful as an effective deterrent. As much as I abhor the policy, it is an effective deterrent. So it shows that if we want to deter something, we have the capacity of deterring it. So the question is why are we not doing the same for pursuing drugs? Why aren't we pursuing fentanyl with the same fervor that we're pursuing those that are here illegally, many of which have never committed any crime other than being undocumented, which is a civil infraction. Many of these people are criminals, but on average, they're not the worst of the worst of the worst at deporting. They're deporting everyone they can find because they basically acknowledged in a court filing, they've acknowledged that they're profiling. So they're going into neighborhoods and they're profiling people. So they're not picking people out because they have an arrest warrant against them, because they have a court order against them. They're just going into areas. If they have a court order against one or two people, and they're going into certain neighborhoods that have a high propensity of people of a certain type, meaning they're Latino, and then getting them all and finding out which one of them are citizens and which ones aren't, letting the citizens free and deporting everyone else. So there is a high level of profiling. They think their profiling is justified, and in the recent and challenging the LA judgment where they are told that they can't profile, they haven't argued in court that they're not profiling. They have argued that they are profiling, and there's a legitimate reason for them profiling. So so it seems that this is a government that's willing to be loose with the application of rule of law, with habeas corpus, with due process, with profiling, to catch people who are just undocumented, yet they can't apply the same fervor to find those that are distributing fentanyl. So, and then the question is, if somebody's an addictive personality and they can't get fentanyl and they're an addictive personality, what are they going to look to replace that fentanyl with? So it seems to me we're still ignoring the main cause of the problem is why individuals have the addictions they have, and how can we become better at treating the addiction, than trying to choke off supply. Because when so many people want something, history has shown us that if there's enough profit involved and a lot of people want it, and there's a huge market, somebody's going to take the risk. Okay, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying the incentive is there, and the only way to reduce the incentive, is to increase the risk. And the way you increase the risk is becoming more effective at arresting the people who are responsible for this. So it's nice that that the Trump administration has targeted a few Mexican banks supposedly for laundering money. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but I doubt all this money is being given. The size of the drug trading in the estimated size of the drug markets in the U.S., I doubt the amount of funds that have flown through the Mexican banks are large enough compared to the total size of the market. That basically they're really being aggressive enough in finding out where drug money is being laundered. You got to go after the money. So if you go after the money, you kill the business. And the government has not done really a very good job of going after the money. They're taking an approach of assuming as little responsibility as possible and going after where the supply starts. But again, the supply has to get across the border. It has to require a whole distribution channel in the U.S. Sales and distribution channels. We don't really even know how much is being manufactured in labs in the U.S. And and then those monies are received in the U.S. I doubt that the U.S. is selling to people saying, pay me in Mexican pesos. I doubt they're walking out with people and saying to the average person, here, where's your crypto wallet? Give me your crypto wallet. These are probably cash-based transactions, and the cash that's being used is U.S. dollars. And I doubt the people are taking these U.S. dollars, and everybody whose sales distribution is crossing into Mexico, depositing into a Mexican bank, because they're crossing the border with all this cash. I think if people know Mexican customs, I don't think many people think they're going to get through Mexican customs with a lot of cash, and think that they're going to end up with bringing the cash into the country, as opposed to maybe the Mexican customs people taking their cash from them, and distributing it amongst themselves. So, I just don't think that that's, highly likely. So we're not really focusing on solving these problems. They're difficult problems to solve. maybe they're insoluble, and maybe that's why we just want to pretend that we're solving it by blaming somebody else and burdening them with solving our problems for ourselves. I've lived my life, excuse me, with many rules. And one of my rules is I don't make my problem somebody else's problem. I try and live my life that I'm responsible solving my problems. I don't make people responsible for my problems. So, and I can't control other people, and I have no interest in controlling other people. I have interest in doing whatever other people behave. I have a responsibility of trying to make sure that their behavior doesn't damage me, and that's by the choices, that I make. And and sometimes it's unpreventable, and that's just life. So, so at the end, we have to assume personal responsibility. We're not going to be a great society if we don't assume personal responsibility. So it's not the supplier's fault; it's the consumer's fault. Okay, the suppliers would not exist if demand wasn't so great, and the demand was so willing to pay such a high price, so that it was so profitable that people would assume the risk involved in doing the business. So so I'm trying to just give these examples as hoping that not only just to convince people that I'm right on these points. Obviously, I think I am, but I'd like to also explain to people kind of how I think, because I think our only hope as a society in being able to resolve conflict, to live in peace and harmony with each other, is to be able to, take our ideologies aside, really look at the facts, look at the evidence, eliminate emotions from it, and look at things from a cold, objective point of view. So, and if we can look at things from a cold and objective point of view, likely more people will find out that they have more they agree to than they disagree with. But and sometimes the problem is that just people just don't care about the other person's perspective, which also is not very good for conflict resolution, is if you only take a look at your perspective and not the other person's perspective. You can get away with that by only one strategy: bullying. So at this point in time, Americans are fortunate to live in a country that has the ability to bully everyone else, and so doesn't necessarily have to really look at the other person's point of view, because it doesn't need to negotiate win-win. We can do win-lose negotiations because we can successfully bully. Americans, basically on a personal basis, seem to think bullying is not a nice thing, but apparently we're happy when our government does it, or when we use the government to use it on our behalf. That's okay because we're not doing it ourselves. We just got an agent doing it on our behalf, but it's still the same thing. Either you think bullying is okay or not okay. If it's okay for the government to do it, it's okay for anyone to do it. If the government is the strongest in the world, and so it can basically force other people to bend to its will, then the strongest person in the school has the right to go in and beat up your kids if your kids are not the biggest in the school, because it's the same philosophical premise. As if might makes right, whether it applies to the U.S. government or applies to the bully in the school. If the principle is we believe in might makes right, okay, then forget about rule of law, and everything is just a function of who's got the biggest weapons, and they win. And then we don't have to debate anything. We can have the Republicans and Democrats can have a joust, in Congress, and whoever the last person standing is gets to write all the rules, and we don't do anything by any sort of conversation. You have a business dispute, don't go to court. Just take out guns, do a duel, and the winner is right in the business dispute. If people really think that that's how we should govern ourselves, if people really think that's how we should behave, I think that's a pretty sad statement of American society if we think it's okay that if you have the capacity to bully, you should do it, okay? Because I don't think any of you who really believe that, if that applies to you in your life, if you're bullied, or if your kids get bullied in school, then you're going to go and you're going to tell your kid, you know what, there's two things. You go to the school and say, terrible, this other kid is bullying my kids, or these other people are bullying my kids, and terrible, throw those kids out of school, or you can, or you can train your kids to learn how to be better at being a bully than the other people's kids are. So your kid becomes the successful bully. So I don't know how many people want to live in that. I don't want to know people that's what they want the neighborhood to be. Okay. So, your neighbor doesn't the neighbor doesn't follow the rules in the community. So you go to the neighborhood, the neighbor pulls out a gun, shoots you, and says, okay, I got the biggest weapon in the neighborhood. So what I say goes, because I got the biggest weapon in the neighborhood. So I think if we want to live in a more decent world, we got to rely upon reason. We got to have empathy. We got to be objective about the facts, and we got to place other people's needs equal to our own. So and that we look for win-win relationships. Win-lose relationships over a long period of time is unsustainable. Every empire thinks their empire will be eternal. The Romans thought they would be eternal. The Egyptians thought they would be eternal. The British, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Now the sun barely rises on the British Empire. The sun's only on the British Empire, a few hours a day, when it never set on the British Empire. The pound sterling was once the reserve currency of the world. So, and we think this will never happen to us. And they say, remember all the people you stepped on your way up, because they're the people you're going to meet on your way down. I don't want to, and if we take a look at the U.S. circumstances today in the world, we might think we have the ability to bully today. The question is will we always have that ability to bully? And then if the day we don't have, and the day we need help, and we no longer can bully for help, but we need the help, will we find that those people we bullied be there to help us, or are they really anxious to step on us, and be reminded of what we did, when we had the upper hand? So, so I don't want to exonerate Mexico of responsibility, nor do I want to exonerate us of responsibility. I sit back and say is that we should be responsible for ourselves. We should not place demands on other people. We should place demands on ourselves, and we should solve our own problems, and we should need to have an honest conversation about diagnosing problems, because if you can't solve a problem, you don't diagnose well, and on average, we don't diagnose problems well. So because we don't diagnose problems well, we're either solving the wrong problem, we're not solving a problem at all, and the problem perpetuates. And I think if we notice the greatest problems American society has had, the problems are perpetuated because they're not easy to solve, and they're not easy to solve through the political process. And it's a mistake that we look to the political process to solving these problems rather than looking to ourselves to solve these problems. So we've tended to feel that we're not responsible anymore for these problems, that we want agents to solve everything on our behalf. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation. So I think it's as legitimate for us to call cartels as terrorists as Mexico could label the U.S. military as terrorists, given the fact that Trump has said that the U.S. military can enter into Mexico at his choice without an act of Congress. It seems to me that if we go into another country, like we did in Iran, and we bomb, we kill people, we destroy infrastructure, we didn't do it complying with international law. We didn't do it by going to Congress. We just had one person making a judgment and we don't have an intelligence assessment that indicates that Iran was on the precipice of having a nuclear weapon. There is no intelligence assessment that says that has been shown to the public. Just like there's no intelligence assessment that has corroborated Trump's statement is that it was a complete, total, absolute annihilation of all the capacities that Iran has, and they have and they have no fissionable material left. So we have no confirmation of that. So given the fact that we've never seen confirmation of that, we've never been provided of that, this might have been an act that violated international law, and Iran could brand us as terrorists. Now, why can't they? Because we say we'll ignore the international criminal courts. Why? Because we can, okay? Not because it's a rule of law. We just don't care, okay? We're above the law. So, I don't know how many people really enjoy relationships where some party says, you're my slave because I have the power to enslave you. So I'm going to enslave you. So, and maybe I might be able to get away with enslaving you for a period of time. And then one day you'll talk to a whole bunch of other people. I'll be a bad slave owner, and people will rebel. Might not be a year from now, 2 years from now, or 10 years from now. But the question is this really a sustainable policy? And is this really what we want the country to stand for? So I know I don't. So I've now gone 90 minutes, so I've gone longer than I intended to. I thank all of you that have watched. I thank all of you that have asked questions, and I encourage on all, whether it's the fine points or the podcast that I have coming up that I will be interviewing other people. I want to encourage you all to ask questions, and as hopefully you might have observed today, that I try to be diligent in asking every question that I become aware of. I've been told that people have commented on previous podcasts. The problem is when I go full screen on my computer, I can't see the comments. So this week I have one of my colleagues who has been tracking people asking questions and then texting me the questions so I can respond to them. So I'm going to continue to try and be, diligent about, as long as I have knowledge of the questions asked, I will respond, as long as it's somewhat related to the topic that's being discussed. If it's completely unrelated, I'm likely to ignore it. So, and I also will address comments as I did today. So that's my intention, is because I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So again, thank you very much, and everyone have a great day. Bye.